Let's discuss the experience of African Americans for a moment. If you were an African American during the wartime period, your hope coming out of this war would be that civil rights would be back on the table. African Americans supported the war overwhelmingly. African American men served in the armed forces, facing racism and discrimination, like we talked about before. African American civilians were prominently involved in war industry work, and there was this hope that this demonstration of loyalty and patriotism to the country would pay off after the war in the form of civil rights advancement, and that was not to be the case. If you look in the PowerPoint and in your textbook, we have instances listed of extreme racial violence, the so-called riot in Chicago in 1919, the Tulsa Massacre in 1921, the revival of the Ku Klux Klan. All of these things, indicators that civil rights is not on the agenda in the 1920s. So for African Americans in the 1920s, you now have a sort of a dual experience. We had the Great Migration during the wartime period, where several million African Americans left the South for the industrial cities, mainly of the Northeast and the Great Lakes region, and those populations who migrated tended to stay. And now we have a new African American experience. You have the traditional Southern experience, but now you also have large populations living in the North. What they have in common is that you may have left the South for New York City or Buffalo or Pittsburgh or Cleveland or St. Louis or Chicago, but you did not escape the reality of racism and discrimination. You still had that in common with the people who went home, who stayed at home in the South. Jim Crow segregation was done by law in the South, in the southern states, but it was done by custom in the northern states. So that sort of pattern of activity still permeated the North, and both of these groups would face continued racism in that regard. The difference between the two is that African Americans living in the northern cities, in the industrial zones, had access to much greater economic opportunities than those who stayed behind in the rural and the small town South. The northern economy was booming in the 1920s, and jobs were plentiful, and African Americans were able to find work in many various industries. Just to give you an example, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the steel mills were booming, they needed labor, and they hired large numbers of African American men to work in the mills. Now, you're not going to be paid the same as white workers when you're doing comparable work. You're not going to rise to the level of being a foreman or a supervisor, but the wage that you did make was far better than the opportunities and wages in the rural South. And we also find that with the patterns of discrimination in the northern cities, we had the rise of small business ownership among African Americans. And these small business owners were part of the core of a small but growing black middle class. And so in the 1920s, just to summarize things, as an African American, you're going to face racism and discrimination, whether you're living in the South or in the North. But what the northern cities did offer was at least the opportunity for more economic advancement than what would have been found in the South. The lack of advancement on the civil rights front was very frustrating for African Americans, and there was one man, Marcus Garvey, and you may have heard of Marcus Garvey. He was a civil rights leader, an intellectual, a thinker, an activist, and he represents the voice of frustration. Marcus Garvey is associated with a term known as Back to Africa. He believed that black citizens in the United States would never, ever be accepted as equals in white society. They would never be treated the same. And he believed that the best alternative for African Americans was simply to leave the country. Now, that is not a practical solution. But it does represent, again, symbolically, the level of frustration of African Americans for the lack of civil rights change. Now, we also want to make note of a very important intellectual and artistic movement among African Americans in the 1920s, among artists, writers, intellectuals, and so forth. And this is known as the Harlem Renaissance. Harlem, of course, is a neighborhood in New York City, and by this period, it was a predominantly African American neighborhood. And it was in this area, and by the way, we don't want to imply that all this activity is restricted to Harlem. Harlem was sort of the ground zero, the epicenter of this activity, but you found these people working in every major city. You would find these kinds of intellectuals and artists in cities like Chicago, St. Louis, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, but primarily the ground zero, the epicenter of all this was Harlem in New York City. And these thinkers were of the opinion that African Americans could no longer just identify themselves through a past of suffering. That African American identity needed something more. It needed something proactive. It needed something to self-identify with a sense of pride. Since early American history, African Americans had been defined by white society's standards and opinions. And the Harlem Renaissance intellectuals were saying, look, we cannot allow ourselves to be defined by the standards and opinions of white society, because it's always in a very negative way. We are a very unique people in the world. We are Africans and we are Americans. There's no one like us. And we have to have more than just a shared history of suffering. We have to be proud of who we are and where we have come from and where we are going. And we have to be more assertive about our rights and our civil rights, our civil liberties. And these writers and intellectuals would frequently talk about a concept they called the New Negro. And the New Negro, simply defined, was this person who is self-aware, proud of who they are, undeterred by white racism, assertive of their rights, willing to be an activist to achieve their rights, never taking no for an answer. And this is a very powerful movement in the 1920s. You may remember the name Langston Hughes, for example. He was a poet, and he wrote extensively about what it means to be an African American. The musician Duke Ellington, who was big in the jazz scene, spent a lot of his creative juices writing about what it means musically, that he was writing, to what it means to be an African American. And it's all about a sense of pride and self-worth and this effort to move forward.